Hello and welcome back to the next in my top 5 Doctor videos. Today we'll be looking at the Doctor selected by you, that being the 4th Doctor played by Tom Baker. Being the longest serving actor to play the Doctor across 7 seasons, Tom Baker does have his fair share of stories, so picking just 5 of them is going to be a difficult but not impossible task. In the comments below, let me know what stories you rank as your 5 favourites, and if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications to stay up to date. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like, and without further ado, let's get into the top 5. At number 5 we have Warrior's Gate. Season 18 is probably one of my least favourite seasons of the show, but this episode thankfully stands out. I'm a big fan of the sort of abstract episode. It does a lot with surprisingly very little. It has its minimalist setting, while also a clever use of time. My only real issue with it is probably how they handle Romana's exit, but given how bad the relationship was between the main cast at that point, I think they were just looking for any excuse to write her out. To be fair on them, Tom Baker and Lala will do their best to try and hide their lack of chemistry, but every so often you do get to see subtle hints towards their failing marriage. Despite their bizarre design, the Tharals are a fairly interesting alien race, and I like how we get to see their history played out retroactively. It's a clever use of time, as I mentioned earlier. All in all, a high point in a fairly low season. At number 4 we have the infamous Sharda. This one's probably cheating, as pretty much everyone knows at this point Sharda was the story that was never finished, but from what remains and all the remastered versions of it, it is a really good story. I originally grew up with the Paul McGann version and was kind of happy accepting that one as the definitive version of the story, but having seen the animated version, or partially animated version, I found that I preferred the original, mostly down to the fact that it was so much funnier. A lot of lines said by Paul McGann were just said as if he was reading off the script, but Tom does such a good job making fairly mundane lines sound really funny, along with all the visual gags, and just the Douglas Adam wit is full on display here. You do a surprisingly good job with the character of Skagra, who could easily come off as a very generic villain, but the performance and the writing really helped to sell him. The secondary cast are very memorable, mostly because it's a fairly small number of characters we focus on, and despite being 6 parts, it breezes very nicely. Would I like this story as much if it weren't for the whole lost aspect of it? It's tough to say, but as a story, Sharda is excellent. And I'd say check it out, but let's face it, at this point, this is one of the stories that almost every Doctor Who fan has seen at this point, or is at least familiar with. And from one Douglas Adams story to another. At number 3, we have City of Death. This is another obvious choice, but it's just so iconic. Great cast, interesting plot, and very, very funny. After the abundance of stories in the Graham Williams era where they were trying to be Star Wars on a budget and failing miserably, the contemporary Earth setting is so refreshing, which is kind of ironic given how overused it ends up being in the new series. It just goes to show an over-reliance on a type of story or setting can make the show stale, and it's really the exceptions that end up standing out. The use of actual location filming in Paris helped to give this story a really classy vibe. Guest cast are all phenomenal. Julian Glover does a great job as the villain Count Scarlione, and Duggan is a really funny character. I'm kind of disappointed he never became a companion. In regards to the Doctor himself, Tom Baker has so many iconic moments in this story.
I say, what a wonderful butler. He's so violent. Well, you're a beautiful woman, probably.
When you compare this to Warrior's Gate, it is shocking to see how great his chemistry is with Lalla Ward at this point, and how much it just declines over time. It's such a shame. It really helped to sell them as one of the best duos in the show, and it's just a shame that it wasn't meant to last.
Hello there.
At the penultimate spot, we have the Seeds of Doom. This era is well known for taking classic Hammer horror type stories and giving them a bit of a sci-fi twist. In this case being taking influence from The Thing from Another World. Now, compared to the Graham Williams era, which tries to be more conventional sci-fi type stories, this trope has a bit more legroom than what Williams ended up doing, as there's only so much you can do with the sci-fi setting, especially when you're on a limited budget and don't really have the imagination to make up for it. In comparison to the original story, the Seeds of Doom takes the decision to start off in a isolated Arctic base, but shifts the setting about halfway through, which helps to keep it fresh, as often six-parters can become quite slow, especially if we're stuck in one location for the whole time. It can become quite stale. A key example of this being the Ice Warriors. However, this episode avoids that, and as a result, it helps to stay fast-paced. As much as the comedy aspect of the Graham Williams era really helped to keep it going, often it didn't really save an episode, it just gave them a nice moment or two. Here, however, there is a good mix of horror and comedy. This story has a quite dark premise and some surprisingly good body horror, considering the fact that it's essentially a kid's show and, again, limited budget, but it really works, and they do balance it out with Tom Baker and Elizabeth Sladen really adding a more comedic touch to the story, which helps to lighten some of the more disturbing aspects. In terms of the villains, Scorby is a really fun henchman character whose sort of like alliances change depending on the situation. Chase is probably one of the most underrated villains of Doctor Who. He's so calm and quiet, it's quite sinister. Now, before we get on to my number one spot, I think it's worth going over a few honourable mentions because, let's face it, there are so many stories in this era which are so good, it's hard to pick just 5 of them. The Robots of Death. This was the first classic Who story I ever saw, and while nostalgia does play a good part in my enjoyment of it, I will admit as time goes on, it becomes less good. It's very much a Graham Williams era type story, but the Hinchcliffe horror sort of saves it, I suppose. The Horror of Fang Rock. Given how much they wanted to get rid of Hinchcliffe because of the horror tone he ended up setting for the show, and how much it disturbed certain children and annoyed people like Mary Whitehouse, I'm glad they didn't immediately switch to a different tone. It would have been quite jarring. Season 15 does a good job as a transitional period, and we do get a couple of stories that wouldn't look out of place in the previous era, as well as the new type of tone Williams wanted to go with. And the Sunmakers. The only thing that really lets this story down is the budget and the poor production, because the cast and the script really sell the ideas that Robert Holmes was creating. and it's just a shame we didn't get to see his vision as he truly intended. But at the number 1 spot, again, this was a really obvious choice, but I have to go with Genesis of the Daleks. This wasn't originally going to be at my number 1 spot, but after rewatching part 1, it is really, really good. And yeah, there are some points in this story which it feels a bit slow, but the iconic moments more than enough make this story. Tom Baker gives a phenomenal performance in this story, which is amazing considering that this was his very first season. And he got such a great story, it's no wonder he became so iconic. And as much as I like Terry Malloy, Michael Wisher is the definitive Davros. Not only is he probably the best written, but I also think Wisher is the best in terms of performance and physicality. It's interesting to see how much he gets on with the Doctor, but their ideals clash, which leads to the conflict between them. The Daleks don't really have that much to do in this story, but the few scenes that they do have are iconic. The initial test that Davros does with them at the end of part 1, as well as them taking over and ending up killing Davros. I'm kind of annoyed that they kept bringing Davros back, because this was really the perfect conclusion for his character.
Pity, I have no understanding of the word.
And those are my top 5 favourite 4th Doctor stories. I'm sorry it was a bit safe and conventional, but there are so many stories in this era which are just generally considered to be amazing that it would make sense that at least some of them I would agree with. I mean, I like most of them. It's mainly the Graham Williams era I'm not a huge fan of. Hinchcliffe, it's mainly just preference. At this point, it's just sort of like which ones are great and which ones are just good. I'd love to hear what your lists are though, so let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and for the next list I'm thinking of doing a modern Doctor this time. If you have any recommendations of which Doctor you'd like me to cover next, again let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.